that this is the year of mercy, right? From the first Sunday of Advent until the Feast of the Immaculate Conception in December. And the day that the Holy Father opened up the holy doors for this Jubilee year, this is what he said. The necessary work of renewal of the Church's institutions and structures must bring us, and these are the important words, must bring us to make alive the experience of God's mercy, which alone can guarantee the Church will be a city upon a hill that cannot remain hidden. To make alive the experience of God's mercy. The experience of God's mercy. Not the theology about mercy, not the idea, as beautiful as it is, or the concept of God's mercy, or the definition. All of that can be well and good. It's good stuff. But all of that, the theology, the concept, the idea, the definition, all of that becomes stuff we know in our heads. And too many times, what we know, and I'm talking not just as a Catholic, but as a priest, I know a lot. And I hope you know that I know a lot. And so what? If all it is in your head, as somebody once told me years ago, you know what? You are out of your mind. And there's too many Catholics and too many priests who are out of their minds. They know the theology, the concept. And that's not what Pope Francis is desiring for this year of mercy. Not to know more about God's mercy or to be able to talk about it, as I am, but to experience it. Because what we experience, and this is true in every one of our lives, right? What you experience is not in your head, it's in your guts, right? It's the difference between knowing about love or singing about love, but something happens to us at different times, and oh my God, this is love. You know it down here, right? And that has the power to change us because it's always there. Whether it happened in the past, you know what this is about, right? Okay. You are always able to draw on it from down here. The experience, and in this case, in the Holy Year of Mercy, it's the experience of God's mercy. Make alive the experience of God's mercy Pope Francis is talking about. So, what is the experience of God's mercy? Well, in this first talk, what I want to do is to look at Pope Francis's own life and how he came to experience God's mercy. Not know about it, talk about it, preach about it, but experience it so that it's here, not here. Maybe some of you have come up and seen these beautiful photographs that we're having today, and what these really are kind of chronological story, beginning here and going over to how Pope Francis experienced and still experiences God's mercy. This first picture is, as you can see, a picture of the Holy Father going to the sacrament of reconciliation in the Vatican, which he does every 2 or 3 weeks. That recalls, we do not have a picture, obviously, of when he first experienced God's mercy, but he talks about that a lot. An experience that he had of needing God's mercy in the sacrament and receiving it. He talked about this. He was 17, and he was on his way to a party on a free weekend in Argentina with some friends, and they were going by a church, and something must have been bothering him inside, and something must have been tugging at him from inside and outside, and he left the friends to go their way, and instead he went into the church for the sacrament. This is what he says himself in a letter to the World Youth Day participants. God's mercy is very real, and we're all called to experience it firsthand. When I was 17 years old, it happened one day that as I was about to go out with friends, I decided to stop into a church first. I met a priest there who inspired great confidence, and I felt the desire to open up my heart in confession. And that meeting changed my life. I discovered that when we open our hearts with humility and transparency, we can contemplate God's mercy in a very concrete way. I felt certain that in the person of that priest, God was already waiting for me even before I took the step of entering the church. That's where Pope Francis first experienced God's mercy. There was something tugging, as I said, inside him and outside him. And he came to realize in that encounter in church that what was tugging at him from the outside was Jesus calling him, "Come, I'm waiting for you." That encounter with God in the sacrament of reconciliation was the first experience the Holy Father had of God's mercy. Not a concept, not the theology, the experience. He knew it down here. This tells us one of the most important things about mercy. If you and I don't believe that we are sinners, or sinners like the rest of people who really are sinners, if we don't believe that we're sinners in need of God's mercy, we're never going to experience God's mercy. We might be able to talk about the theology, the idea, but if I really don't need God's mercy the way other people do, I'm out of my mind. I don't know it. And what happens when that happens is that we always become judgmental on our part. And this is something that Pope Francis frequently talks about. You know, how can they do that? Look at them. You know, I don't do that. You know, judgmentalism. Looking down on others who definitely need God's mercy and don't go and get it. That was not Pope Francis. He knew that something was wrong with him, or he never would have entered that church, right? He needed something only God was able to give. And it was there in that encounter with the priest, the confessor, God's welcoming, forgiving arms in the spirit of that priest. That's what prompted him to unburden himself of his sin. As he says, he came to contemplate God's mercy in a very concrete way. And as you know, he frequently refers back to this. And when some interviewers ask him, well, who are you as Jorge Bergoglio? His first words are, I am a sinner. And I do not say that in any theoretical way, a down-to-earth and practical way. I am, not just used to be, I am a sinner in need of God's mercy. So in our attempt to make alive the experience of God's mercy, the first question, you can write that down if you want to, the first question that we need to ask ourselves then is, do I really accept myself as a sinner in constant need of God's mercy, as Pope Francis does, or do I somehow think that I am better than others and don't need God's mercy the way they obviously do? Like many Catholics, for example, have I gotten beyond the need to go to confession? I don't need the sacrament. Why? Why? If I do go, do I really open up myself, as Pope Francis says, with humility and transparency? Or do I try to gloss things over, trying to make it look kind of good, at least on the surface? That's the first picture that we have here, which is the first chronological event of his experience of God's mercy. Not the theology. I've experienced it. The second picture over here is a reproduction of the painting by the Italian artist Caravaggio, which is entitled The Call of St. Matthew. And take time later to look at this. Here is St. Matthew. He's not at his tax collector's box. He's in this tavern or wherever, and he is bending down, looking at his coins. And here is Jesus, who is pointing at him, looking at him, and obviously calling him. And this is very important, this painting, to Pope Francis. Listen to the words. Well, to give a little bit of background also, is that the day that he went into that church when he was 17 was September 17th. And that is the feast of St. Matthew. And listen to the words of the Holy Father to see how important this painting is to him and his experience of God's mercy. These are his words. When it was necessary for me to come to Rome, I always tried to stay near the Church of St. Louis of Francis, and I would go there to contemplate Caravaggio's painting. That finger of Jesus pointing at Matthew, that's me. I feel like Matthew. It's the gesture of Matthew that strikes me. He's holding on to his money as if to say, no, not me. This money is mine. Here, this is me, a sinner on whom the Lord has turned his gaze. And I'm still sinning. Over and over again in his homilies and talks, Pope Francis frequently comes back to how important it is in our spiritual lives to constantly contemplate how lovingly the Lord gazes on us in our sinfulness. It's not just here in this painting, it's on every page of the Bible. In Genesis, we read, the Lord looked on everything he had made, and he saw that it was very good. And in the Gospels, we know the passage where the rich young man came up and was unwilling, that wasn't Matthew, but he too was unwilling to give up his riches, and the Lord looked on him and loved him. In his unwillingness. And we remember how at the Passion, when Jesus was betrayed by Peter, Luke says that immediately after the cock crowed, Jesus turned and looked at Peter. And it's always the same kind of look of love, mercy. And Peter went out and wept because he was still loved and he didn't deserve it. That's what Pope Francis is hoping for us during this year of mercy. Will you let Jesus look on you and melt you with that look in the midst of what you're unwilling or fearful about giving? Will you let him look? And will that look melt you? I always think That's a second M word when it comes to mercy. If we've experienced mercy, we become melted. That's what happened to Matthew, right? He became melted. And that's what changed him. And so you see, as we look at Caravaggio's painting, and as we try with Pope Francis to make alive the experience of God's mercy, we need to ask ourselves a second question. Each one of these portraits, or whatever you want to call them, has a question. And the second question that this picture brings is, what's the focus in my spiritual life? What's the focus? Is it me and what I'm doing and how hard I'm trying? Or how bad I am? Is that my focus? If that's my focus, even if it's surrounded by spiritual stuff, the focus is me, me, me. How am I doing? What's happening for me? How can I look better? How can I get the focus off yourself? Do you see? That's what Matthew was doing. Jesus was calling him, and he wasn't wanting to look. As long as I keep the focus on me and what's going on for me, that's okay. If I look up and see the power, the beauty, the melting ability of that look, then I'm going to be transformed. Because I've never experienced, even with my money and all this other stuff that I think is so important, I've never experienced a look so tender, so loving as that. Where's my focus? Me? What I'm doing? Or even what I need to do? So get your act together? Or look at how I am looked at and how everyone else is looked at. What's the focus in my spiritual life? This painting tells us, as it tells Pope Francis, get the focus off yourself and how good you are or how bad you are. And in the midst of your sinfulness and progress, let yourself be gazed upon by the loving, tender face of Jesus. That's what'll change you, not you. The third picture over here is the coat of arms of Pope Francis. In many ways, it's just the natural result of the first two pictures. The other experiences of God's mercy. You will see down here his Latin motto, which is very hard to translate into English, and as the Pope himself says, it's hard to translate even into Spanish. Miserando atque elegendo. What this basically means is having had mercy shown to me, and in that very act of having had mercy shown to me, I am chosen, elected, I am chosen, desired to bring that to others. But it's all because I was looked at with mercy. Now I choose you. Never forget who you are. And now go out and look at others the way I have looked at you. Miserando atque eligendo. He got this from I think it's in the 7th century or 8th century, a sermon from Saint Bede the Venerable, when he, Saint Bede, was talking in a sermon about Matthew. And this is what Saint Bede says, which Pope Francis discovered again on the 17th, reading this sermon from way back. This is Saint Bede's. Jesus saw the publican, Matthew, and because he always sees by having mercy and choosing, he said to Matthew, "Follow me." Pope Francis says that his own call to follow Jesus as a Jesuit and a priest came on that memorable September day, the feast of St. Matthew in 1953, when he experienced God's mercy in his sinfulness and God looking on him and choosing him in his sinfulness and mercy. Because he needed mercy and was shown mercy, he is called eligendo to help others know the same mercy that they're looked at in the very same way with whatever problem they have trying to hold on to, that they're looked at with the same tender, merciful, forgiving love. That's what we discover in this third picture, the Pope's coat of arms, miserando atque eligendo. So this brings up a third question in our effort to join Pope Francis in making alive the experience of God's mercy. All of us here, not just the Pope, all of us have been chosen for some particular vocation or task. We might have the mistaken notion that because we're not a priest or religious, that we're really not chosen in the same way that other people are. Well, that's true, you're not chosen in the same way. I'm not chosen the way married people are. It's different, but it's still the same call, right? And it's being called in our need for mercy. And so then, can we give to other people? Do we believe in our call and where it comes from? Or do we have this idea that I've got to be perfect before God is happy with me or God can do anything with me? And that's a very common mistaken notion, isn't it? You know, oh, I'm not perfect. I'm a sinner. Well, and other people, Well, was Matthew a sinner? Yes. Was Pope Francis a sinner? And did God reach out in the sinfulness and say, "You're loved, and I choose you in your messed upness to be good for other people"? Get the focus off yourself and see how other people need the same kind of love and mercy, right? So the question is, If, like Pope Francis, like Matthew the Apostle, I have been chosen to be a witness of God's loving mercy to the people and the world around me, do I recognize that? Do I accept it? Am I trying every day to be true to that call? All I have to do is, how do I look at other people? What do they experience from my look? Is my look more that judgmental, or that word that we don't hear too often, but it says a lot? I've got a prickly kind of look, you know? I look at you and you don't fool me a bit. What do people experience when they see my look? Is it judgmental? Or is it tender, loving, understanding, compassionate? That's the third question. And you know, we live in a culture that very rarely has, we'll talk about that in our second talk, very rarely has mercy on our lips. We do not live in a culture of mercy. People get what they deserve. And that's the way it should be. Okay? That's what we want. Truthfully, my brothers and sisters, if God gave us only what we deserve, we might as well all commit suicide. Because there's no hope. I get, Matthew gets what he doesn't deserve. And that's why there's hope. That's why there can be joy. But we're not living in a culture that reflects that. People get what they deserve. And that's what we try to do. Can you feel, even when we say that, the anger that is behind that? Mercy melts us. And it doesn't gloss things over. You still are wrong, and you've got to be accountable, but you're not going to get what you deserve. You're still worthwhile. So the fourth image is the picture from the first Holy Thursday Mass, which the Holy Father had only weeks after he was elected Pope. Instead of celebrating liturgy on Holy Thursday in the splendor of St. Peter's Basilica, he chose instead to travel to those who don't live in splendor, to those who don't deserve a gesture like this, to inmates, young inmates at a Roman juvenile delinquent center, Casa del Marmo. And the picture shows how during Mass, the Holy Father, in imitation of Jesus, got up and took off his outer garments and took a basin of water and knelt down and washed the feet of these betrayers who didn't deserve it any more than Peter, James, John, and Judas deserved the washing of the feet. But they had it. They got it. because they, in their messed upness, were still worthwhile, right? The look was always there, consistent. And you also know that 2 of the 12 people whose feet were washed were Muslim, and 2 were women, young women. And that was against all the rules. The rules until a month ago when the Pope changed them. But the rules were, in imitation of Jesus, who washed only men's feet, whoever has the Holy Thursday Mass will wash the feet of 12 men. He knew the rule, and he didn't observe it. And a lot of people were shocked. He's going against the rules. And he was. Because he was trying, again, to look on everybody, not just men, everybody the way Jesus looks at everybody. They're all eminently worthwhile in their messed upness, right? And they all deserve and get this expression of God's love. But it was against the rules. And so we can come to our 4th question from this picture. What do we follow in our Catholic Christian spiritual life? What's the criterion? I know what's right and what I'm supposed to do, and I will do it. Or this is what Jesus asks. Jesus never went against rules, but he went beyond them, right? Because God's love demanded it. He never put down rules, but he was never confined by rules. You see, one of the things, and we've all met people, and maybe we can be too much of an echo in that in our own lives. There are some people for whom it is far more important to be right than it is to be loving. I'm right, and I might be. And that's what's important. Pope Francis was wrong, but he was loving. For Pope Francis and for Jesus, if I have been melted by that look of love, my need to be right is also going to be melted, right? And I will look on other people in their messed upness and not judge them or treat them just according to rules. What is needed? What is loving? Where is mercy? What do I need to do? So you see, all 4 of these pictures end up sharing with us not the idea of mercy. Forget it. Or do you have the proper definition of mercy? Have you experienced God's mercy? And if you've experienced it, like Pope Francis, then you know this kind of tender, loving look in the midst of your messed upness. And that's what lets you get up and say, nothing else is as important as that kind of look. And then if I have been looked at in that way and chosen, it's like, well then, look at other people the way you've been looked at. Everybody. Don't deny the rules, but don't be confined by the rules. Because none of us have always observed the rules, and we're still loved and been shown mercy. So in this time of break, let's take some time in chapel to try to be quiet and to listen to what Jesus is speaking in us, how we're being tugged to go back to that very first one. What's tugging at us inside and outside? Well, listen and let yourself hear and be melted. I just want to close again with how we began. These words of the Holy Father in opening up the holy doors. The necessary work of renewal of the church's institutions and structures must bring us to make alive the experience of God's mercy. Because that experience alone can guarantee the church will be a city upon a hill that cannot remain hidden. So God bless you, and we'll come back in 15, 20 minutes, okay?